We're going to be presenting today about a project that we have been on a long journey for the past 10 years or so. My co-presenter is Chris Sims. He's UAE Field Services Director for SAP MENA.
Hi, good morning everyone. The views in the presentation are mine and Alan's and don't represent SAP's official views, or not necessarily anyway.
So the agenda for today is Chris is going to start out with the story of SAP, a fascinating story, been a hugely successful company over the past few years. I will share the story of SAP and TOC combined. We'll switch back to Chris, and then we'll end off with looking into the future about what are some of the things that we've discovered, maybe from the book Necessary But Not Sufficient, that are still applicable and maybe could be modified. And then we'll, if there's some questions at the end, we'll open it up for questions. So I'll hand over to Chris.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's a great privilege to be here. And we decided to start off with the story of SAP, not just because it's a good story, but more because SAP to many people is the ERP system. I just wanted to start off by showing that SAP is a lot more than the ERP system these days, which means that the questions that we have to answer from a TOC perspective, from a necessary but not sufficient perspective, are actually a lot more complex than they were 10, 12 years ago when the book was first introduced. SAP basically started off with being the first ERP system, although it wasn't an ERP system because it was a mainframe. In '79, R2 came out, which would today be considered an ERP system, a fully integrated accounting, MRP, maintenance, etc. package. In the early 90s, R3 was introduced, and that's probably what most people think about when they think of SAP as a software package. We then developed some new applications, still known in the SAP community as the New Dimension products, which brought CRM, supply chain, business warehouse, etc. And the little picture here is to show where ERP fit in and fits into the product portfolio now, to see the increased complexity that we get. So in 2005, we service-oriented the product and brought out NetWeaver. And today, our core strategy is in 5 areas: applications, analytics, mobile, database and technology now in the cloud, all powered by HANA, which is a new dimension database that does things incredibly quickly. And when we come later on in the presentation, we'll look at what that potentially means, that ability to do things really in real time, or virtually real time in a couple of seconds, as opposed to the quasi-real time that's been there over the last 20 years or so. And again, if you look at If you look at where the ERP system now is, it's still a main source of what we do, but as a product, we now have over 300 products, of which ERP is one, and that's not counting the smaller mobile, etc. applications. So when we look at necessary but not sufficient and using TOC for SAP for ERP, we're talking about a lot more than we were 10 years ago. Why are we talking about value? Well, it's very simple. We have a model where we try and sell software. Happy customers buy more software. Happy customers tell lots of other customers about how good our software is. So we've been focusing on value creation, of how to get value out of what we sell, for a number of years. It's probably not a great area that SAP is known for, but we've actually done some quite interesting things in this area, and I think that the relationship that we have with the TOC community now hopefully will go on to lead to the next dimension and the next iteration of this area. So in 2000 we invented something called continuous business improvement. Alan will cover that a bit more in his section. We now have a very flourishing what we call value engineering, which looks at, okay, if you buy SAP based on some benchmarks, here's what value you should be able to do. Typically used to get over the hurdle of business cases for boards, but it also acts as a way to measure what you can hope to achieve out of implementing the system and what you actually did achieve. Because we found out, probably to our surprise, that just implementing the software doesn't really make sure that you attain any value. We have a business transformation services arm, which is SAP's management consulting arm, with about 700 people globally. And that was the area where I first contacted Alan when I was heading up BTS for the MENA region. Moving on to date, we've reiterated and now focusing far more on innovation and using design thinking methods as a way to foster innovation both internally and at our customers. However, it's fairly true to say that in spite of the technology advances, in spite of the number of new applications, in spite of what we've actually done to try and get the value message across and actually realize the value, it's still a bit of a black box. Some customers do. I'm not sure who's in the room, but probably more customers don't actually achieve the full value or even any value out of their implementation. And that, in essence, is why we started talking together and started this journey. One of the questions that comes up is, for 20 years or so, almost since I started in the IT industry and implementing SAP, the question has been, how do you measure and how do you obtain value from IT? Over the years, I've come to think, well, actually, that's probably the reason we can't answer it very well is it's entirely the wrong question to ask. It's like asking, how do I get value from a road? The real question is, how do I use IT effectively to enable whatever my business strategy, whatever my growth is? And it's a small, maybe semantic point, but it actually has quite big ramifications when you're starting on a journey or looking to how best to use IT, especially today, when the range of options that are open, the range of applications that are there are so much greater than they were before. Okay, so I'll hand over to Alan to talk a bit more in detail about his story with SAP and TOC.
So the story with my involvement with SAP, under initially the guidance from Dr. Eli Goldred, was already starting in 2000. SAP contacted me. They had a client, the Crown companies within British Columbia, and these companies were on the verge of kicking out SAP. The implementation partner had not done a great job at implementing it to the extent that invoices couldn't be sent out. The organizations were losing massive amount of revenue. And SAP had just started this initiative called Value SAP, and this was one of the first opportunities. I had, in parallel, completely coincidentally, developed an approach called Value ERP, using the thinking processes of TOC and the 5 focusing steps to be able to go in and quickly analyze where value can be unlocked in a company. And it was my first attempt. We started working with SAP. I trained them basically what was an equivalent of a Jonah program in the evening. And during the daytime, they would apply what they've learned. They would interview the customer, get the undesirable effects, come back, build the CRTs, the conflict clouds. A lot of effort, but we discovered a lot of value, enough to get the customer to be very happy and also give us a recommendation to go to some others. That's really how it started. African Explosives was the next one. I had a fantastic relationship with African Explosives, the largest explosives company in the world, with their CEO at the time, and he gave us an opportunity to not only implement theory of constraints in every single aspect of the business. It was probably one of the first holistic implementations of TOC. But when Dr. Eli Goldred visited South Africa and mentioned that he was working on necessary but not sufficient, the CEO volunteered, and we were the first case for trying the approach on implementing SAP throughout the organization to basically do 2 things. We were using TOC, CCPM, to implement the SAP project. And at the same time, we were using SAP to implement TOC. Because as you probably know, one of the main challenges of a TOC implementation is how to make it sustainable. And if you don't build it into the ERP system, it simply won't be sustainable. Since then, we've gotten involved in many other clients, Adidas, Tata Steel, Ditch Witch, ABB that I presented previously, Random House Publishing, largest book publishing company in the world, Daiwa House, incredible experience with them. When we do an analysis to try and identify or answer a simple question like where is the value lost in an implementation like SAP, Goldred gave us a practical approach. He said, face the inconsistencies, have the courage to face the inconsistencies, and secondly, go and challenge some basic assumptions. And in all these projects that I've been involved in, that's essentially what we've been trying to do, is to try and discover more and more of the opportunities, the high leverage opportunities, where value is lost in every stage of the cycle. So I'll give you a quick summary. We have very little time today, only 30 minutes, and of course, if you want more details, you're welcome to stop us afterwards and speak to us. But if you think about an ERP system like SAP, can bring value in three ways. It can allow you to execute business processes faster and more accurately. And time is money, so you should expect dramatic results if you can do that better. It also should allow you to provide the right management information much faster and much more accurately. And the result of that must be much better, faster decisions at all levels. Again, very high expectation of the value that should be unlocked. And lastly, it should improve the user experience to an extent that they can become more productive, that they enjoy their job more, that they can do more with the same resources. So the expectation of value is significant. What Goldred did in Necessary But Not Sufficient is he tried to systematically answer the question of where value was being lost. And he basically said that a technology like ERP can bring benefits if and only if it can diminish a limitation. So probably the first place to start is, if you have a value expectation, is to find out what is the limitation it will diminish and what will be the value if that limitation can be diminished. And I'll share with you some examples later. The second question he asked was, what benefits, if any, can you expect to get from the technology if the rules that were put in place to live with this limitation were never changed? And the famous example he gave in Necessary But Not Sufficient is an ERP system can dramatically speed up the calculation of the net material requirements planning. How did people live with the fact that it would take a very long time to net all of these things? They had a practical rule that said we will do it once a month. We'll run the MRP once a month. You implement the ERP system, there's no real value, right? Why? Because we would expect, if we could do things faster, we expect our inventories to come down, we expect our response to the market to be much faster and therefore capitalize more on getting more sales or even higher premiums. So when you see that there's no value despite the fact that you've introduced the technology, it can only be the second thing. It can only be the fact that the rules that were put in place that acknowledge those limitations were never changed. And in fact, many cases that was the case. Years after the ERP implementation, you ask people how frequently are you running your MRP, and they go once a month. So this was a key for us, is to understand not just the limitations that can and should be addressed by a technology, powerful technology like SAP, but what were the rules that were put in place previously that acknowledge these limitations, that if they are not changed, you cannot expect significant value to be derived. So what we did was we did an analysis. We said, here's a box that represents the amount of customers that should be getting value from their SAP implementations. And obviously, the red box is representing those customers that are not getting value, not getting full value. Why is that the case? We found 5 main mistakes or causes for the problem, and they represent basically linking to each step of the process: the business case development, pre-sales, the design and scope, the planning, execution, and auditing. What we found in the business case side is that very few companies were actually trying to quantify the full value that should be received if limitations are overcome. Essentially what they were doing, they were looking at efficiencies. After an SAP implementation, we'll need only 8 accountants, not 10. What is the value of saving those 2? So they were looking at mainly cost avoidance, which is a small fraction, of course, of the larger potential that can be unlocked. Plus, frequently, actually, the data entry requirements are more significant if you want to go to real time. If you're capturing transactions rather than doing it monthly, you're now doing it daily, you can expect that your data transaction entry has to go up. So frequently, it required more resources, not fewer. And as a result, many of these implementations, the ROI calculations simply didn't make any sense because there were no reductions in people. As Chris mentioned, SAP has known about this problem for a very long time and have been actively trying to fix it. One of the methods is their value engineering division that does a great job at coming in and doing best practice analysis, kind of one of those spider web diagrams that says the best in your industry is here, you are here. The problem with that is that there's an expectation that if you close the gap, value will be unlocked, which is not necessarily the case. So how do you fix that problem? This was the main problem with the business case. In the design and scope, because few customers know what they really need, the consultants basically put in just in case, right? And as a result, the scope becomes very large. There's lots of customization because there is no time to actually look at how to standardize on best practices. They are putting in common practices that are causing a lot of enhancements or add-ons to the standard SAP. Of course, the planning and execution side, these are large, typically multi-project environments. They are not implementing or applying the best practices of CCPM. And from an auditing point of view, there seems to be no focusing mechanism where SAP, the implementation partner, and the customer can sit together and say, we've identified in this area of your business, if we can apply technology here, this is the amount of additional value that can be unlocked to provide you with a sense of what should be the roadmap into the future. So, of course, what do you do to solve the problem? Is you have a very simple mechanism to define and quantify the value. We use an analysis using the viable vision questions, necessary but not sufficient questions, and throughput accounting model to do that. How to focus and simplify the scope, differentiating between must-have and nice-to-have. In many examples, like what I presented yesterday, we've used the strategy and tactic tree as a mechanism to really get agreement on the simple and standard scope, and then applying CCPM best practices and auditing tools for the rest. So let me just quickly take you through what that means. So the first step is quantifying the business value. Frequently, there is no strategy in the business, clear strategy. They might have a goal, but there's no how they will achieve that. So in those cases, if we do get the privilege to contribute at a strategic level, we can use the questions that Goldratt developed when he was doing viable vision analysis on companies. What is the target that you want to achieve? How much sales do you need in order to achieve that target? How can this increase be accomplished? What are the conditions that if you could satisfy them, you could get higher prices, you could get more volume? What internal changes are needed in business processes, policies, measurements, etc., to build, capitalize, and sustain such competitive advantages? And lastly, can the company and its supply chain partners cope with the expected growth rate, or will one of them become a constraint, or will the back office become a constraint? So simple questions, and we've tested it a couple of times with workshops with SAP clients. This type of process can be done in about 2-3 days maximum. So it's a very quick way of getting agreement on overall what is it that we're trying to do with this project that will bring the business growth that the company is expecting. We use the throughput accounting mechanism as a simple way of quantifying the benefits. If you look at this case, a company with $1 billion of sales, if we can just use SAP to prevent them from losing 1% of their average prices, which means why would people make pricing mistakes? A new price is calculated, but it isn't pushed through to all the divisions, and they keep selling at the old price. Or a salesperson gives more discount than what they are authorized to do. A 1% change in price is $10 million. Variable cost doesn't change, operating expenses doesn't change, so the whole $10 million will drop to the bottom line. So just using a technology like SAP to prevent pricing mistakes of 1% in this case will bring you a 20% additional net profit. We used this mechanism for Daiwa House, they're a $20 billion company. We had strong evidence that there was at least 0.5% pricing mistakes that were linked to not using technology appropriately. That was a $100 million benefit. The whole project previously had to be justified based on $10 million of laying off people over a period of time through natural attrition, which for a $70 million project was a 7-year ROI, which wasn't very good, and you can imagine as a result they struggled to get it passed through the board. Well, preventing a 0.5% pricing mistake is $100 million in the first year. It could pay off the whole investment in the first year. The same thing is true when you look at what will happen if we can use this technology to ensure we don't have stockouts. How much will sales increase and what will be the value? And lastly, if we don't get the opportunity to contribute at the strategic level, but only in a modular level, they're only implementing finance or maintenance and production or HR, we can use the questions of necessary but not sufficient to say, what is the power of the technology that we're introducing, whether that's a mobile device or a device like HANA that can basically do processing somewhere between 10 and 1,000 times faster than what was ever possible. It can compress data 4 to 10 times more than what was ever possible. So once you understand the technology, you can then say, what limitation does it diminish? In which areas are we not running our systems frequently enough because simply the data overload in the past has been to such an extent that it slows everything down? What will be the value if we can do it instantaneously as we get updates? So the necessary but not sufficient framework can be used even if you're at a departmental level and you want to try to see the technology that you're introducing there, whether it's a mobile device, whether it's a new database technology or an ERP module, what should be the expected value if you can diminish these limitations. But then be careful, you need to think about what rules to change. And in the slides, we've given you a whole list of some of the things that we've discovered. For example, pricing lists. Right, pricing lists are typically generated twice a year based on some kind of standard cost. And the assumption is the guys go out there. If they sell more than the standard cost, they'll make money. If they sell less than it, they'll lose money. But why can't we have dynamic pricing lists based on whether there's capacity available in our factories, whether there's capacity available in our suppliers? Because if there is, we know anything more than variable cost will drop to the bottom line. At the same time, if we're already overloaded, selling at the traditional price might not be good because it will cause other orders to go late. So why can't we do it dynamically? Pricing list was an old simplifying assumption that was acknowledging a limitation. No reason to have those things in there anymore. And as a kind of what would be the outcome of a 2-3-day intervention? We build essentially the profitability gap for the company. We see where they are losing profits at the moment. We see what it is that they have to put in place to achieve that. Get basic agreement with them. What do we need to change to build this capability to capitalize, to sustain? And the outcome of that is process, policy, or measurements changes. And then we can answer the question that Chris started off with, is how can we use technology to implement, sustain, accelerate the implementation of these changes? And an example that we've included in the slide deck of what we did with ABB, I went through that in my workshop yesterday. So in summary, we used a mechanism like a strategy and tactic tree to get agreement on what changes are needed. We can then convert those into a pipeline of projects, sub-projects using CCPM. For each of those sub-projects, we determine their critical chain plan. We buffer them. We get an advantage of 25% faster. And that's the common norm that we've seen. It's possible, for example, die warehouse was originally planned for 24 months. We ended up executing in about 18 months, saving about $10 million just in consulting fees and gaining an additional $50 million of business advantage because of that. And then using mechanisms to audit to see where we need to focus on and where additional gaps are. And whenever you get stuck and you have to make a decision, is it worthwhile to add more resources to do something internally? Use throughput accounting as a simple mechanism to quantify the real benefit. So I'll hand back over to Chris now to share with you just briefly the experiment that has been done so far and the results.
Okay, thanks. And looking at the watch, I'll have to rush through this fairly quickly. So we've started trying to use some of the things that Alan talked about in SAP in MENA. Started off externally by using it with customers, but also starting to use some of the concepts internally as well. One of the first things we did at the start of this year was a training program, which was a considerable effort from our guys to take them out of their daily work. So we came up with a compromise where basically we were doing the training from 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 10 o'clock at night. So that was the way that we found to actually shoehorn this into the time. And it was actually quite effective because people were working on projects and bringing experience from the projects that they were working on into the training, which was quite useful. It was actually being able to really implement some of the things that you learned in the training the very next day, which is, as you know, is quite rare.
It also gave us an opportunity to really focus on what somebody needs in order to address those 5 mistakes, basically. That was what the idea was, and to allow them to practice it on real cases.
So I'd say that we're very much at the start of the journey, and hopefully we'll get a lot more going forward, both in MENA and in other areas of SAP. And hopefully we'll be able to update you on that in future conferences. I won't go through these. I'll just highlight the first, we think, TOC implementation in Saudi Arabia, which is a difficult area to implement TOC. And just a look to the future, if we look at what was in necessary but not sufficient, the Mafia offer at the end of necessary but not sufficient, what has actually happened to necessary but not sufficient and the ideas there over the course of the last 10 years? Well, if I look at something, the concept of outsourcing is now a major business area. I doubt very much it's really being done in the idea that Ellie had in necessary but not sufficient. Global licenses, we already do that, and we have done for many years for our larger customers. And in MENA, we're looking at 2 versions. The standard business case viable vision, and also one of the things that's quite interesting is the offer that we can achieve the business case, if it's a standard business case of an SAP implementation, before we actually implement the system.
So think about that for a little bit, right? How do you achieve the full return on investment of your SAP implementation before you've actually gone live? And the idea that Chris came up with is brilliant. It's saying that during the investigation, when you're trying to figure out what to change, you discover many things that can be changed quite quickly in kind of manual mode, using spreadsheets, etc. So why don't you implement those? It gives you an opportunity to really test how they will work. And by the time that you go live, you have a really good idea of what the real specification should be like. And the business have already started getting the value. And now they see SAP as a way to just speed this thing up, because manual processes are cumbersome, etc. So I think an absolutely brilliant idea.
And gives a negative, or a negative time to ROI, because most people start calculating the ROI and after the project goes live. So when you can get that, it's like having a negative cash flow like Dell used to have. So we're quite hopeful that that's an interesting thing. So I just wanted to finish off with a look to the future. We've said how much technology has changed. The basic ideas of necessary but not sufficient are still there. The core value of an ERP, the limitation that it overcomes, probably needs to be updated. So what are we talking about now, the generic limitation? So if we assume that a company has done a wall-to-wall TOC and SAP implementation, achieved their 3 or 4 year viable vision, what next? I'm not going to attempt to answer that question, especially in a minute or so, but I'll just leave you with a few thoughts. In my view, when we talk about the new technology with HANA, being able to do things in real time, the real value of that is in 2 areas, one especially, and that's the ability to very, very, very quickly experiment in the market. Alan mentioned the impact that small price differences can have on the bottom line of a company. So imagine that you can test in a given demographic, a given market, a 1% change in pricing, or a small promotion, very, very targeted promotions, run it for a couple of days and see what happens. And actually have the analytics coming in real time with the algorithms built in, which should be based on some TOC algorithms, etc., to be able to tell you whether this is a good promotion or not.
Sorry, just Chris, another example of that is an experiment that we're running at Random House Publishing, not just on the pricing side, but what we are trying to do there is checked the viability of a mechanism that I call dynamic surplus replacement. So imagine a bookshop. They've decided to select 10,000 books out of a population of 1 million. Their assumption is that the sales velocity of the 10,000 they've selected is in general faster than the 990,000 that they did not select. So why can't we use technology like Hannah's capability of SAP to monitor the actual sales velocity of the ones that they didn't select in bookshops similar to theirs and continuously compare it with the sales velocity of the items that they did select? And if we find out that there's ones that are substantially selling faster in other areas, similar bookshop size to theirs, why don't we just arrange an automatic dynamic surplus replacement strategy? So things that previously were simply not possible because the calculation power wasn't there, the ability to compress data just wasn't there, that's now available with HANA, is opening up amazing opportunities for running very fast, effective experimentation.
And this sort of thing also leads to ideas of how you restructure an organization, how an organization has to change to be able to take advantage of these. Because it's not simply, okay, we'll decide to do a pricing experiment. It's actually having the organization set up to design, quickly implement, and then quickly scale successful experiments and pair unsuccessful ones. We're seeing this somewhat in the consumer industry with trade promotions, etc., whatever people think of trade promotions as a method. And I think this will be pervasive across industries over the next 10 years or so. So I'll leave you with that thought, is where we talk about limitations as policy or physical limitations in the meaning of necessary but not sufficient. I think that going forward, it'll be a limitation purely of the imagination, once everything is already in place. So, open to questions. I'm not sure whether we actually have any time for them.
We have about three
if
minutes
not,
or so.
we're available all
Yeah.
today. We're here all week, as they say.